Welcome to Focus on Albany. My guest today is attorney um, Jim Walden, and we are going to talk about redistricting in New York State. So, Jim, this year has been totally crazy. So, from your perspective, what has gone on and what has been settled?
Well, as I'm sure you know, Cynthia, and thank you so much for having me on. In 2014 was a big year for New York. As you've probably been able to tell, states all across the country are engaging in various forms of voter suppression, election rigging, trying to disenfranchise people and stack elections. And 2014 ended a process where New York declared that it was not going to do that. It was going to remain above this kind of hyper partisan craze that seems to be going on, where it seems like our elected officials and many others are undermining our democracy. So 2014 was really important because the New York legislature, at the direction of voters, passed a constitutional amendment that basically said no more game playing. That when you redraw the maps after a federal census, which happens every 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
there are demographic changes. You change the maps based on the changes in the demographics. You don't try to what's called gerrymander, which is playing with the voting district lines to try to help one party or help another party or help incumbents stay in office.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this whole process that was supposed to be followed with an independent commission that's made up of political appointees. And they couldn't draw maps that everyone agreed on, and they were supposed to be told to go back to the drawing board and submit a compromised set of maps. That's what the Constitution requires. It requires that this committee, that's called the IDC, that the IDC draw maps and submit them, and then the legislature has the opportunity to say, no, go back to the drawing board, and then the IDC is supposed to submit another set of maps. In this circumstance, the legislature violated the constitutional amendment by just taking the matter into its own hands and redrawing lines. And surprise, surprise, the same games that had been played before 2014 now happened again, and largely with Democratic incumbents drawing their challengers outside of the lines so that they would have a clearer path to being elected. There are a bunch of other things that the maps did that I can describe if you or your listeners are interested, but that's what brought us to court. And we weren't the first to court. There was another set of plaintiffs that challenged only the Senate maps and the congressional maps. They didn't challenge the assembly maps. And that case went all the way up to the Court of Appeals, the highest court in New York. And the court said very clearly, the Senate maps are no good. They're unconstitutional. The congressional maps are unconstitutional. And in a footnote, they said, by the way, the assembly maps are unconstitutional as well, but since you didn't challenge them, we can't do anything about it. That's where our group of clients came in, Gary Greenberg,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually Gavin Wax, and with his counsel, Aaron Foldenauer, and then Paul Nichols. And we first tried to intervene in that case and were shooed away by the court. And so we filed another case, and that case went, the judge that heard the case in the first instance refused to declare the assembly maps invalid by saying that our clients had waited too long to file suit. The appellate court disagreed and threw out the maps, but said that there wasn't enough time to redraw the maps for the election that's already started. The primary election has already started. So unfortunately, the result is that the voters are stuck with unconstitutional maps for the 2022 election. And now the process is going to go back to the lower court to redraw the maps and figure out whether those maps are going to apply in the next election, which is 2024, or whether the court is going to declare, because essentially whatever assembly comes out of this election is going to be essentially an unconstitutional assembly. We're hoping that the judge says that he's going to declare a special election in 2023 and cut the terms of these assembly members short.
But from my understanding is the Democrats have such a stronghold on the majority in the assembly. So even if districts are challenged, it's going to remain a Democratic majority in the assembly, right?
Cynthia, that's probably true, but at least the elections will be free and fair and competitive. And we shouldn't allow our elected officials to not only abuse their office, but violate their constitutional oath by drawing lines intended to preserve their own political power. That's just wrong. That's anti-democratic and it's anti-American. And I think that it's a real shame that the legislature resorted to this kind of game playing. And certainly it's my hope that the voters pay attention and that they make their voices heard at the ballot box, but that remains to be seen.
But wouldn't you say that the redrawing of the maps every 10 years previous to this year, the people who drew them, did it for their own benefit? I mean, this is nothing new, right?
It's nothing new, Cynthia. That's absolutely right. But that was the whole reason why the voters in a referendum decided overwhelmingly that they wanted a constitutional amendment. Now, changing the Constitution is not easy. That's not something that happens every day. But the voters felt so strongly that they did not want to be part of this cabal of states that rigs elections and makes them non-competitive to protect incumbents, that they asked the legislature to amend the Constitution. And so 2014 was supposed to be the dawn of a new age where New Yorkers could stand up with integrity when they criticize other states for playing these games. And instead, the first time they had the opportunity to, the legislature clawed that back, pretended as if the constitutional amendment wasn't even passed, and drew the maps to help insulate incumbents from real challenges. And that's really a shame.
My understanding is in 2014, a new district was formed, and that was Cecilia Kachik's district, which Gary Greenberg ran in this time, or 2 years ago, and that was supposed to make everything okay, and it was Cuomo's doing, and Cuomo kicked it down the road until now, right?
So, Cynthia, you may be right. You're telling me things that I wasn't personally aware of.
Okay.
We came into the litigation fairly late, and believe me, it was drinking from a fire hose. I do understand some of the problems with some specific districts, but I'm not familiar with that one,
Okay.
the history
Okay.
of that one in particular.
So, it dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, and ultimately, what's the final outcome? There's the Senate races, there's the Assembly races, there's the congressional races, and it's still kind of up in the air. It's crazy. So, yeah. What's your opinion about everything?
Well, I think that our elected officials did a real disservice to the average working people in a couple of different ways. First of all, they should have never resorted to an unconstitutional map drawing process. That to me is the original sin here. But they made it worse by splitting up the primaries between June and August. If they really cared about voters and they really wanted real competition and real voter turnout, they would have aligned all of the primaries in either in August or in mid-September, and they would have had plenty of time to redraw the maps. But the third thing that they did was they wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxpayer money defending in court a map they knew was unconstitutional, even after a judge declared what they had done unconstitutional.
Mhm.
They still continued to spend your viewers' money on a litigation that they were sure to lose. So, in that way, again, these are our elected officials. These people take an oath to defend the constitutions against everything, all
Mhm.
enemies, foreign and domestic. And in all of these various ways, they violated their oaths of office, and that's not consistent with the public trust.
I had. This is the week As we're recording this, this is the week of early voting. So I went the other day to the polls to cast my ballot. And I looked at the ballot, and it was only for governor, and the rest of the slate will be voted upon in August. And I thought, wow, this is crazy. Just for one office, they split it like this? I thought that was such a waste of money.
Yeah, so I haven't voted yet. I'll vote in the regular timetable. And I'm neither a Republican nor a Democrat, so I actually don't get to vote in a primary at all. But the
Mm-hmm.
ballot that you should have seen should have had all statewide races on it, and it also should have had the assembly on it, right? That was the whole point in the litigation, that the assembly was saying the primary is about to begin. We're just days away. So I'm not sure, obviously, what party you are, but that it's strange that your vote or that your ballot only had the governor's race on it. That seems
Correct. And I assume the rest of the offices will be in August.
the Senate primary and the congressional primaries will be, I believe it's on August 23rd. So people
Right.
are going to have to get out the vote again and then get out the vote a third time to vote in the general election. So can you imagine all of the extra expense that they incurred by splitting these primaries up and making people go back to the polls? I mean, the expense is extraordinary and the inconvenience is
Hmm.
extraordinary. And as I understand it from at least the early results, the voter turnout is the lowest it's been in 20 years. That's not a surprise. In fact, I think that that's exactly what they were hoping for.
Well, that's a sad indictment of the electoral process, isn't it?
I think it's a sad commentary on the people that are in charge. I think that in many ways we have a group of people that are much more interested in maintaining their own political power than they are concerned about the voters of New York. And
Uh,
if New Yorkers tolerate that, then they can't really complain when their elected officials do bad things, because now they know it.
right.
They members of the Assembly, the Senate, they've all gotten behind this plan, and they seem to be supporting it in lockstep. And
Mhm.
so the voters need to know that these elected officials will put their own selfish interests above the will of the people when push comes to shove.
But ultimately, that should come as no surprise to you, right?
Well, you know, as I said to you before we started the interview, I've been through a lot of litigation with all sorts of administrations, Democrat and Republican, federal and state. And it is unfortunately consistent with my experience that whether it's elected officials or it's the heads of agencies, they do what they want to do, not necessarily what is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the power of money in elections dissuades really quality candidates who want to put their own interests in the back seat, dissuades them from running. And so the system is in desperate need of reform. And that's a very complicated problem to solve.
Right, right. And it doesn't look like it's going to be solved anytime soon. Wouldn't you agree?
I definitely agree with you there. And
Mm-hmm.
it certainly feels like, especially in some states where it's not just rigging voting lines, as bad as that is, it's actually trying to suppress the vote, provide misinformation or disinformation to voters. That it seems like we've strayed from our lofty democratic principles, and now we're down in the mud. And I'm hoping that there is a real reform movement, and maybe it's time that we need a serious third party to come in who's really dedicated to principle over party, um, the interests of the voters over the interests of the elected official. That to me seems like something that smart people who care about reform should really think about.
Are you aware of how the third parties have been shut out of the process this year?
Yes. Uh,
I think it's horrible. You know, the amount of signatures went from 15,000 statewide to 45,000, and that's really a lot of work, you know?
Yeah, and they try to defend it by saying, "Oh, we only want serious candidates." Yeah, but getting signatures is not a matter of whether someone's serious or not. It's a matter of how much money you're prepared and able to spend to get canvassers who will go and get your story out. And they increase the numbers for one reason and one reason only, and that is to make it harder for third parties to challenge the established parties. And
Right.
this is not the America that I grew up in. It's not the America that I love, and I hope it's not the America that remains once people see how desperate these politicians are in holding on to power. I mean,
So one
President Trump is a perfect example.
so one day I was reading the newspaper, and lo and behold, I see a picture of our friend Gary Greenberg, and the article said that Gary was filing a suit. Can you tell us a little bit about the suit that he had filed?
Yeah, and listen, I give Gary a lot of credit. Gary is a great American. He stood up for some really important causes,
Yep,
including for victims of child abuse.
yep.
He knew that this was not going to be popular because the legislature had already dug in its heels to defend these maps, and he's unfortunately had to endure a lot of unfair attacks from people who are trying to hold on to their own power to try to discredit him. And thankfully, it hasn't worked because Gary really has emerged as the hero of this whole story.
Mm-hmm.
So Gary had us try twice. Once we tried to file what's called a motion to intervene. And this is in the case that started out in Steuben County before Judge McAllister.
Okay.
That's the case that went all the way up to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said the Senate and the congressional maps are out, but we can't deal with the assembly maps because the people who brought that lawsuit for some reason weren't challenging the assembly maps.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so Gary stepped into the breach and said, this is wrong. We shouldn't have people voting on unconstitutional maps. So we tried to intervene in that case, and the judge said, sorry, but you're too late and it will cause too much acrimony to let you into the case now and to add the assembly maps, even though that same judge on his own motion, right? The judge did this on his own, had declared the assembly maps unconstitutional. So we were disappointed and somewhat surprised that we did not win the motion to intervene in Steuben County. So when Gary's an undaunted person and he's when he is acting on principle, which is, he always is,
Mm-hmm.
he can be very dogged. And so he said, listen, let's file somewhere else. And so that's when we joined forces with Gavin Wax and his lawyer, Aaron Foldenauer, and Paul Nichols joined, who was a gubernatorial candidate that the party didn't want to challenge for the Republican in the Republican gubernatorial race. And so we filed our petition in Manhattan, and we sought sensible things that would have been to the benefit of voters. We asked for the assembly lines to get thrown out, and we asked for the current election, meaning the one that's happening now, for the assembly and the statewide races to all get moved to either late August, or for all of the races, all of the primary races, to happen in mid-September, which is the historic date. Historically,
Right.
the primaries for the parties was always in mid-September.
Mm-hmm.
So the judge that had the case, his name is Justice Larry Love, dismissed our petition and said, I'm not going to make a decision about whether the assembly maps are unconstitutional. And he claimed, you filed your case too late. And on appeal, we argued before the First Department and ultimately prevailed. And the First Department threw out the maps as unconstitutional, the assembly maps. But as I said before, wouldn't stop the current election. So the bottom line is that even though we've at least saved voters from 9 more years of using an unconstitutional map, for the current election, people have to understand that when they're going to cast their vote, they're casting their vote on a map that the court has found to be unconstitutional. And that's a
Well,
real shame.
well, you know that Gary was instrumental in getting the Child Victims Act passed. And in the process of him doing that, he was instrumental in flipping the Senate to the Democrats. So then when he went to run for the state Senate, the state Senate didn't embrace him. They turned their back on him. And, they picked somebody else to be the party favorite. That to me was a real slap in the face.
But Cynthia, this is not going to surprise you because you've been around the block many times. What these people want is they want to maintain control. That is more important to them than anything else that they do. And part of maintaining control is controlling who gets on the ballot. And if the person is a go along Charlie, then great. But if there's someone that actually thinks independently and is willing to compromise and cross party lines, if they have innovative ideas that the people at the top of the pyramid don't like, then suddenly they find all of these gimmicks, these games, whether it's increasing signatures, redrawing voting districts, disqualifying petitions based on flimsy information and evidence. There's so many different tricks built into the election system, and that's got to be part of the reform, because we need more competition in election races, not less. We need more people from the outside who are not part of the system to run if we want change. And we need change,
I, I,
nationally and in the state.
I totally agree with you that there has to be people from outside the system to come in and make the change, incite for the change. But it's so rigged against somebody like that that it's almost impossible.
And Cynthia, the real shame of this is these elected officials and their cronies, what they hope for, what they think they can count on is stupid voters, right? They think that voters don't really take the time to understand the issues. They don't, the election law is extremely complicated. All of these tricks that they play have a legitimate stated purpose, but behind the scenes, in closed doors, in darkened rooms, it's all rigged. And if it's happening here in New York, which holds itself out, I think, rightly in some ways, as kind of the bastion of democracy, just imagine what's happening in regressive states where there are fewer people of color, fewer women, fewer outsiders even available to run.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your law firm.
Oh, that's nice. I didn't expect that. So I was a big law guy after I left the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was a federal prosecutor for about 9 years, not doing any election or corruption cases. I was focusing on organized crime. And after about 9 years there, I went to a large international law firm, and I stayed there and moved to a different firm for about 9 years. And then after, about 14 years in big law, I decided I wanted to start something that was I didn't say it's not my own, it's ours. And so I have now 11 partners and about 35 associates. And we are a litigation boutique, which means we don't do transactional work other than a little bit of trust and estates work like wills. We have one of our partners that does that work. But the rest of us are litigators, and we litigate everything from commercial disputes. We handle criminal cases, we handle investigations, and it's a lot of fun to be part of a group that we're a very democratic group. We vote on everything, and and part of what we do is to spend part of our time, a big part of our time, doing these kinds of pro bono cases, so that although we're in private practice and we're trying to make a living like everyone else, we're also giving back and trying to solve some really knotty problems. And we've had a lot of success, and it's been really gratifying to show some of the younger lawyers that even if you're at a big firm, mostly handling corporate work of one form or another, that you can tackle big problems and get real results that matter in people's lives.
And you have a website?
Yes, it's wmhlaw.com.
Great. So people can get a hold of you that way,
Well,
right?
yes, they can. Yeah.
Okay. So you've been listening to John Walden.
Jim.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Jim Walden. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
And this is Focus on Albany. If you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube page. And thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. And thank you, Jim. Jim.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been fun.